morning. Good morning. Well, I'd be remiss if I didn't begin by thanking New Direction. Robert, we told, it's great to be here back in the Baltics. In fact, I haven't traveled to Europe in quite a few years. I'm quite embarrassed about that. But I think it's no important time to be here than now with everything that's going on in Ukraine, but really what's everything going around in the continent. And although this is my first time here in Estonia, I feel very close to your country, and I'll tell you why. So before I was in the think tank world, I was in the United States Marine Corps. And my first deployment overseas, this is back in 2003, was for the Iraq War. Now, most of you probably know this, but Estonia was a prominent member of the coalition that went to Iraq. And in Iraq, I had one of the more, I guess, honorable, but one of the more gruesome jobs during the Iraq War. You might have heard of search and rescue operations, SAR. Well, what we did was called search and recovery, meaning that we went to the battlefield to locate, identify Marines and soldiers that had already been killed in the war and get their remains so that they can have a proper burial. In one of the operations that was west of Baghdad in the Anbar province, I met a young Estonian soldier, a sergeant, who was actually from a light infantry platoon, and he volunteered to help us. So I was able to get to know him for a few days, and we had quite a good chemistry. We talked a lot during that time, and he would ask me, where are you from? And I'm serving in the armed forces, obvious, from America. And he would say, no, okay, I get it, but where are you really from? And then I would say, well, I guess he's talking about my ethnicity, so my parents are from Bolivia. And he'd say, where in Mexico is that? And I would say, no, it's not in Mexico, it's in South America. But it didn't matter, because in his mind, I'm from Mexico. And I'll tell you why he thought I was from Mexico. It's actually because it's a little known fact, but the third nationality to have the most casualties in combat in the first year of the Iraq War, after the United States and the UK, was actually Mexican nationals. And that's weird, right? Why is that when Mexico was not a member of the coalition? Well, it's because in the U.S. military, specifically in the Marine Corps, in Camp Pendleton, California, 1st Marine Expeditionary Force, we had so many U.S. residents, Mexican nationals, serving in our armed forces, that when they were killed in combat, they were counted as Mexican nationals. Now, our Estonian sergeant knew this because he processed some of those remains. And so nationality is actually something I want to talk to you about today. But before I do that, in case you're wondering if I'm going to meet up with my Estonian friend here while I'm here in Tallinn, he actually does not live here anymore. He lives in the Czech Republic. The last time I saw him was about 10 years ago at a military conference in Prague. And guess where he took me? He took me to the only Mexican restaurant in all of Czech Republic. It's called Czech Mex, believe it or not. And so, great food. But by the way, if I go out with you anywhere this weekend or these few days, please do not take me to a Mexican restaurant in Estonia. But in a more serious note, the reason why nationality is so important is because the state of the affairs in the world today. This is a visualization of a recent report done by the Economist Intelligence Unit that has a thing called the Democracy Index. And what they do is they measure the state of democracy over time. They've been doing this for the last 16 years. And what we can see is basically more than a third of the world is living under authoritarian rule, meaning 37.1% to be precise. Back in Washington, this is a big part of the foreign policy discussion. The rise of authoritarians and the democratic backslide in many parts of the world. There was actually a good article written by a prominent democracy scholar, Ann Applebaum, called "The Bad Guys Are Winning." It was I believe it was in the Atlantic, if I'm not mistaken. And I like the article, but I think there is a fundamental flaw in the premise. And it's actually a major flaw in this whole conversation about democracies versus authoritarianism, which is that, it's on the screen, nobody calls themselves an authoritarian. Nobody's publicly and vocally defending authoritarianism. The most authoritarian nation states in the world call themselves what? Call themselves democracies. So when we get into this war of words and definitions and deciding what gets labeled as a democracy or what gets labeled as an authoritarian, we end up falling into a trap that tries to define democracy when we should be defending it. We end up inadvertently establishing a false moral equivalency between true representative democracies and those other kind of quote-unquote democracies that use sham elections to disguise the fact that they're actually dictatorships with tyrannical regimes. We know which countries they are. They're on the map. It's the Cubas and the North Koreas, Russia, Iran, China, who all have bastardized the terms of democracy and have introduced the greatest period of authoritarianism that we have gotten to know in modern history. So in the end, perhaps I do agree with Ms. Applebaum in that the bad guys are indeed winning. But the question is why? Part of the problem is that we in the freedom movement spend too much time arguing about our differences. Whether it's libertarians or conservatives, classical liberals or Christian Democrats, we tend to focus on what we disagree on instead of finding common ground against common adversaries. This is a huge mistake. Because when the dark wave of authoritarianism comes crashing over your country, it won't care whether you're more of an Austrian economist or Chicago school, whether you've read Hume or Hayek, they will take your freedoms away all the same. There has not been an authoritarian, radical, leftist government in the world that has come to power without first dividing the right and pitting us against one another. So we should not let them do this. But we need to start by finding common ground, and doing so we can debate core concepts that we can unite around. The first is the simplest, I think, but very powerful concept of individual liberty. The idea that people are born free and we are free to choose the way we live our lives responsibly. I say it's the simplest because I have not met anybody in the freedom movement that is against individual liberty. In fact, I think if you were, you wouldn't be part of the movement. So I think it's something that we can all agree on. The second concept, however, is not that simple. The second concept is nation-state sovereignty. It's a concept that's often lost among freedom scholars, even more so among democracy scholars. It's sometimes confused with statism, concentrating economic and political power in the state. That's not what this is. Others think it means ethnic nationalism, an ethnocentric approach to politics and economics. That's certainly not what I'm talking about. But there is a form of nationalism. It's called civic nationalism, which is at the core of our identity as a nation state and the patriotism of our people. Civic nationalism is not about thinking your nation is above any other, but it's about having love of your country, respect for your flag, and being proud of your heritage. I can tell you firsthand that when you go to war and you make first contact with the enemy, it's not your love of liberty that's going to flash before your eyes, but rather the flag on your shoulder and the pride of your countrymen who are fighting alongside you that's going to give you the courage to push forward. But you don't just see this in war. You see this expression of national sovereignty every 4 years. You see it in the Olympics. You see it in the World Cup. Citizens from all walks of life, united by a common experience, standing up for their national anthem and saluting their flag because they love where they came from. That's a good thing. And this is being lost among many in the freedom movement, and we need to recover this. Democracy would have never reached the heights it hit in the 20th century had it not been for 1648 and the birth of the modern nation state. The rules-based international order would have never brought the most peaceful and prosperous period in history had democracies not had respect for individual liberty and national sovereignty. Many democracies are losing that respect today. Frankly, we wouldn't have won the Cold War against communism if we didn't understand this is the core of our being and that threat remains. We live in an anarchic world, and there is no world government, and nor do we want one. But me, Joseph, with all my individual liberty in the United States, I cannot do much against a hypersonic missile from China, which is why I need the nation state. Because in its truest form, national sovereignty within a representative democracy is the expression and defense of the individual before a violent and turbulent world. And that's what's at stake. It's not just about democracies versus authoritarians anymore. China, Russia, and Iran are not just trying to dismantle democracy, they're trying to redefine it by taking away territory and changing geography. So how did I come to this? Well, it's because I studied a country that was once the beacon of prosperity in the Western Hemisphere and has now, in just 22 years, lost all of its individual liberty and lost all of its national sovereignty. I'm talking about Venezuela. This may be one of the few times during the conference that you'll hear about Venezuela, but let me just tell you a couple things about the country that's happened in the last 2 decades. If you're worried about drugs, 1/3 of all the cocaine trafficked throughout the world comes from the Venezuelan-Colombian border. Or maybe you're worried about your financial institutions. About 2/3 of the massive money laundering cases in the EU are attributed to financial flows that deal with Russia and or Venezuela. Switzerland, Netherlands, Spain, Italy, and Portugal all have major money laundering cases that stem from illicit financial flows from Venezuela. But probably what's capturing most of the headlines, it's the world's largest refugee and migrant crisis that has now this year surpassed Syria, with almost 7 million people fleeing this country since 2014. But this did not happen because of a civil war. It happened because of a brutal socialist totalitarian regime that decided it was going to take its country and use it as a weapon of war. What you see on the screen is a table. It's a research study that we're working on that we're going to publish soon, where you see this club of countries that have lost all freedom, all is a deterioration of all basic freedoms inside the country, but have maintained control over their territory. That is now the recipe. What you see on the far, I guess your far right on the screen, those are the anarchic states that don't have any freedom, don't have very little freedom, but also don't have any control over their territory, Somalia, Yemen. The other countries, up in the ones that are in the circle, are countries that are writing an authoritarian playbook. They're learning from one another, they are sharing intelligence, and they are figuring out how to take away freedoms from the rest of the world. And this was done by design. Hugo Chavez, back in 2007, he created a strategy for the country designed around asymmetric warfare. And in his strategy, he actually published this in his military. In his strategy, he said, and I quote, "I will break the chains of the old conservative imperial and colonial geography of Venezuela," and he did so in a matter of 3 years. He completely fragmented the constitution, changed the constitution of the country, and used it to be able to capture the rest of Latin America. Vladimir Putin is doing the same exact thing inside Ukraine. China is looking to do the same exact thing against Taiwan, and Iran is trying to do this throughout the Middle East. This is something that I think we need to start to understand as how warfare has changed over time. War and all its complexity is actually very simple. Warfare is nothing more or nothing less than compulsion. If I can compel my adversary to bend to my will, I win that war. And when we're talking about nation states, we're talking about political will. That doesn't mean I have to rely on military force. In fact, there was an inflection point for this in the 1990s. I talked about Iraq, but I'm going to take you to the first Gulf War in 1991, when the United States went to Kuwait, which was called Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm, and we repelled the Iraqi army in a matter of weeks, if not months, to come over and taking away that sovereign territory. But the world was watching. At the time, Iran had just finished 10 rounds with Iraq, the same military that was repelled in months. It took them 10 years to come to a tie. The Soviet Union had collapsed, and Russia was figuring out what it was going to do to recover. China was not yet on the world stage and not had the economic clout that it built throughout the 21st century. And they all looked at that conflict and said, you know what? I'm not going to fight the Americans with conventional war. It would be foolish to do so. I'm not going to go soldier for soldier, missile per missile. We're going to adapt, and we're going to find new ways of warfare. This is the birth of the Gerasimov Doctrine in Russia. This is the birth of Qasem Soleimani in Iran. This is the birth of the PLA's unrestricted warfare in China. So they decided to cooperate even though history was not on their side. And in Washington, we have a lot of conversations about, do we have more cooperation or competition among China, Russia, and Iran? And I've always sided with the argument of, we absolutely have cooperation. They are building a true alliance. Now, it may not be an alliance built off historical precedent. In fact, Russia and China were adversaries during the Cold War. We know this very well. Iran is a theocratic state as opposed to a communist government. However, they have united under one common purpose, which is to change the rules of the game, to impose their way of governing around the rest of the world, and to capture territories that might have been lost throughout history. And perhaps the reason I know this is because the region of the corner of the world that I look at in Latin America, we see no competition among these three actors. In fact, we see something called the three-quarter standards. You can see it on your screen. 3/4 of Chinese credits and loans, not investments, because that goes further, but 3/4 of Chinese credits and loans to Latin America go to the same four countries: Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Bolivia. Those are the most authoritarian states inside the neighborhood. 3/4 of Russian military sales go to the same four countries, and 3/4 of Iranian bilateral agreements, MOUs, go to the same four countries. That means that they are planning this together. There is strategic cooperation, there is strategic planning, and these are cards that they have not played yet, even in the Ukraine war. When Vladimir Putin gets tired of getting his ass kicked in Ukraine, he will play the Venezuela card. But they have done so in a way that's aligning themselves under the strategy of asymmetric warfare, but is not unlike things that we've seen in the past. In fact, in our lifetime, this may be very new, but if we go back more than 100 years, we saw unnatural alliances start to form in the sense of what was bringing the world to a war. The empires of the past, whether it was Germany, Japan, or the Ottomans, despite their cultural, linguistic, and historical differences, tried to unite to preserve a different way of life. And had they won, we may be all living under some king at this point, but they did not. And that led to Nazi Germany, and we defeated that as well. And we won the 20th century, and we won the 20th century not because of our bombs and our bullets and our bunkers. We won the 20th century because of our conviction in our values, because of our ability to put our differences aside and to march forward because we knew that the threat was bigger than any one individual or any one nation state. And what that means is that we defeated this before, we can defeat this again. But we're going to need a new class of intellectual entrepreneurs. We're going to need new think tanks that push past the fear. If there's one thing that COVID-19, the pandemic, showed us is how scared the world really is. How quick people were willing to put away their basic freedoms for a little sense of security. And a false sense of security, because as we learned, it really didn't matter how long you locked up, the infection was going to happen none the same. But if you push that past that fear and unite with all those that cherish freedom, on the other side of fear is freedom. So I think all of you are going to have to rise up to this challenge. All of you are going to have to be able to push past that fear. But the good news is you're not going to do it alone. We're here from the United States because we're going to fight alongside you. We go to Latin America, and you'll find the same allies. Go to Africa, Middle East, any part of the continent, and you will find those that are dedicated to fight, to cherish the freedoms that they enjoy or would like to enjoy in some cases. In fact, I met New Direction at a conference in Bogota, Colombia, and this conference is very calm compared to that conference, because this was the first day. This was around this time at that conference. This was a freedom gathering, much like it is today, mostly with Latin Americans. And the Latin American version of Antifa, which here is called Primera Línea in Colombia, came and destroyed the hotel in which we were staying at. They threw boulders, not just bricks, they threw boulders at the hotel. If it wasn't for the police, they probably would have killed somebody. And I remember seeing a young man, it was a young man from Colombia that was just attending the conference. It might have been his first time being at one of these things, and he was scared. Because he wasn't like, if you're in the room, you heard some noise, but you were pretty relatively safe. But if you were at the lobby, I was in the lobby because I was waiting to give my presentation, and I saw this young man who I think was arriving a little later, and he was scared Because you might see it on TV, but when it's right up in front and personal, it becomes very frightening. And he was hesitant whether I should go to this conference. They're throwing bricks at these people. They're trying to kill them. Do I want to be a part of that? Just because I like Austrian economics? And he looked at himself, and I didn't say anything to him. He looked at himself, and he said, you know what, I came all the way here, I'm going in. He went inside, he stayed the whole time, and I think that's the kind of spirit we need. He was fearful. It's not it's not me, it's not the guy that went to Iraq and everything that can face these fears. The guy that's never seen it before, but decides to keep going forward. And that's the kind, I think, of people that we're going to need in this movement to be able to defeat these challenges. So in closing, what I'd like to do is, and I know we're all friends in the room, so I'm going to ask you to do me a favor. I'm going to ask you to please stand up, if you don't mind. Please stand up. And be careful with the water bottles. So please stand up. So we're all friends, but just in case, put your cell phone in your pocket. I'm going to ask if you can close your eyes. Close your eyes. And point to where is north. Point to the north. Where do you think north is? Right? Anywhere you think north is. Okay. Now open your eyes. Through these forums, through these conferences, through the leadership of groups like New Direction, over time we will all be able to point in the same direction. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you very much.